There are royal families whose power shaped continents, and then there are those whose destinies were shaped by something far darker. The Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty was once the most feared and powerful ruling family on earth. They commanded gold from the New World, armies from Europe, and dominance over seas that seemed endless. But behind the shimmering facade of palaces and power, behind portraits filled with jewels and embroidered magnificence, there was a truth no painter could hide, a truth etched into their very bones. It begins with a decision, not made once, not made twice, but repeated through centuries. A belief that royal blood must remain pure, untainted, preserved at all costs. And so, generation after generation, Habsburgs married their own cousins, nephews married their aunts, uncles married nieces, and bloodlines folded in on themselves like a collapsing star. With every generation, the physical price grew heavier, jaws distorted, bodies weakened, minds clouded, and souls crushed under invisible weight. But those inside the dynasty could not see the danger. They believed purity would preserve their power. Instead, it prepared their destruction. Long before the final tragic king was born, signs were already there. Court physicians whispered of strange deformities in children who should have been heirs. Babies born frail, unable to survive infancy. Young princes unable to walk or speak or comprehend the world around them. Yet in the grand halls of Madrid and Vienna, the truth was silenced. The empire depended on appearances, not reality. The story of the cursed bloodline truly reaches its height with one child. A boy born in 1661 whose very existence would become a symbol of a dying empire. His name was Charles. He would later be called El-Hechizado, the Bewitched. And even on the day of his birth, the midwives exchanged worried glances. His body was small, fragile. His jaw, unmistakably Habsburg, jutted so far forward that he struggled to close his mouth, let alone chew food. But the deeper issues were hidden. His brain developed slowly, too slowly. He would not learn to walk until he was nearly 4. Speaking would take almost twice as long. And yet this child, so clearly suffering from the weight of generations of genetic damage, was the heir to the greatest empire on earth. Inside the palace, officials and advisors pretended nothing was wrong. They dressed him in gold brocades, placed crowns upon his delicate head, and trained him to sit on thrones that were physically too heavy for him to support. No one dared speak the truth aloud. The fate of the Habsburg Empire rested on a boy who, by all medical accounts, was not expected to reach adulthood. But Charles did live, barely. Each year was a battle between life and decay. He was constantly sick, constantly fatigued, constantly falling victim to fevers and seizures. And every time he recovered, the court declared it a miracle. But miracles cannot maintain an empire. As Charles grew, people began whispering. Their king was unusual. Their king was weak. Their king was unnatural. And in a world where science had not yet replaced superstition, every strange illness demanded a supernatural explanation. So the people decided that Charles was cursed. Some thought the curse came from a rival noble family. Others believed it was punishment from God. But many whispered something far darker, that Charles had inherited the sins of his ancestors, that the dynasty itself had been damned. And Charles, the broken king, was merely the vessel of their doom. The court tried to hide it, but foreign ambassadors, shocked by what they saw, reported everything. They described a young king who drooled uncontrollably, who could barely eat solid food, who stared blankly during meetings, who forgot conversations the moment they ended. And yet, the pressure on him grew heavier with every passing year. Because the empire needed one thing from him, an heir. The single thing Charles was least capable of providing. Marriage after marriage, ceremony after ceremony, prayers whispered in every cathedral in Spain, nothing changed. Charles remained childless. And with each failed attempt, the fear deepened. Without an heir, the entire Habsburg Empire would collapse. Enemies circled like wolves. Factions within the court began plotting. The future of Europe trembled. And Charles, barely understood why everyone around him was so afraid. As the royal physicians desperately searched for cures, the court took a darker turn. They summoned exorcists. They performed rituals. They even opened the graves of former kings, seeking signs of curses carved into their coffins. Behind closed doors, women accused of sorcery were tortured, interrogated, forced to confess to bewitching the king. But the truth had nothing to do with spells. It had everything to do with a dynasty that had ignored the laws of nature for centuries. Charles's body was failing. His mind was failing. And the empire was crumbling with him. And this is only the beginning. As Charles II entered adulthood, the empire expected him to transform into the monarch they desperately needed. But adulthood brought no transformation. Instead, it revealed how deeply his body and mind had been shaped by the centuries of inbreeding that produced him. Foreign diplomats wrote of a king who could barely coordinate his movements, who stumbled when he walked, who stared with vacant eyes across rooms where the fate of nations was debated. His jaw, enlarged and twisted, made eating a struggle and speech a constant challenge. Yet somehow this fragile man was the center of Europe's greatest political storm. His first marriage was arranged with the hope that perhaps fate might be kinder than biology. Marie-Louise of Orleans was young, vibrant, and reportedly kind-hearted. She tried, more than anyone, to bring warmth into Charles's cold and paranoid world. But even she could not change the fact that Charles's body simply could not do what the kingdom needed. After years of failing to conceive, whispers turned into accusations. Some claimed Marie-Louise was barren. Others said she was cursed. Many believed she was deliberately preventing the birth of an heir to sabotage Spain. The truth was far simpler and far crueler. Charles's reproductive system barely functioned at all. Still, Marie-Louise was blamed. The court, already drowning in fear, suspicion, and absolute desperation, turned on her. She became trapped in a palace that watched her every movement. The stress broke her. She fell into deep depression, stopped eating, and eventually, at just 26 years old, she died, suddenly, without warning. Officially, it was an illness. But many believed grief and pressure ended her life long before nature did. Charles remarried, this time to the ambitious and politically sharp Maria Anna of Neuburg. But even she could not produce an heir. Each passing year tightened the noose around Charles's fragile reign. And the more the kingdom panicked, the more the king slipped into spiritual terror. He became convinced that demons were tormenting him, that forces of darkness were sabotaging his body, that he was being bewitched from inside and outside the palace walls. The church, seeing an opportunity, filled the void. Priests performed exorcisms in the royal chambers. Holy water was sprinkled on the king's food. Relics were placed under his pillow. Monks chanted at all hours of the night outside his door. What Charles needed was a physician. What he received was ritual after ritual, each one convincing him more that supernatural forces ruled his life. Yet the truth was undeniable. His lineage had destroyed him long before he was born. His chromosomes were a battlefield where recessive genetic disorders clashed endlessly. His bloodline had been wound too tightly, too dangerously for too many generations. The empire saw this but could not admit it. Foreign governments saw it and prepared for war. Inside the palace, Maria Anna maneuvered to convince Charles to name her relatives as heirs, while rival factions pushed for alternate candidates. The king, overwhelmed, confused, and frightened, became a pawn in one of the greatest succession crises in European history. Meanwhile, his health collapsed entirely. He suffered intense digestive issues, chronic infections, debilitating seizures, and episodes of blindness. Some days he could not stand without assistance. Other days he could not swallow. He aged faster than anyone his age should. He looked decades older than his years. His mind suffered as well. He forgot names, places, entire meetings. He drifted into hallucinations. He believed he saw shadows moving on their own, heard voices whispering when no one was present, and felt invisible hands gripping his throat as he breathed. The court whispered that the king was dying. The people whispered that the dynasty had already died. It all came to a breaking point in 1698. Charles, desperate for answers, agreed to a horrifying ritual. Against the objections of his doctors but with the full support of the church, an exorcist was brought in to determine whether the king was under demonic possession. 4 hours, the priest questioned him, chanted over him, and delivered a diagnosis that shocked even those accustomed to superstition. He claimed Charles was afflicted by demonic forces, that witches had cursed his body, that sorcery had targeted his seed, making it impossible for him to produce a child. This was not the Middle Ages. This was the court of the most powerful monarchy in Europe. Yet superstition had replaced science because science had no explanation for the dynasty's collapse. Charles's final years were marked by isolation, perpetual illness, and overwhelming fear. He was surrounded by advisors who fought over his inheritance rather than cared for him. He became paranoid of everyone, convinced they wanted him dead, convinced that shadows had turned against him. And in a tragic way he was right, not about demons but about the reality of palace politics. The moment he died, Europe would plunge into a war that would reshape the continent. And so, as Charles approached the end of his life, a greater question haunted the empire. Was the fall of the Habsburgs the result of political choices, or the slow vengeance of biology itself? By the dawn of the 1700s, the Spanish Empire, once the treasury of the world, once feared by every European power, was silently collapsing. There were still palaces, still gold, still armies, still ships, still titles that stretched across continents. But at the center of this vast machine was a single man whose body could no longer sustain the weight of an empire. Charles II, the Bewitched, lived his final years in a haze of pain, confusion, and spiritual terror. Some days he could not stand. Some days he could not swallow. Some days his own reflection terrified him. Advisors whispered about the future in shadowed corners, thinking the king did not understand. And most of the time, he didn't. He often asked why Spain suffered famine, why gold shipments from the Americas had slowed, why the nobility plotted in secret. But the truth was unspeakable. The empire was dying because the king was dying. The king was dying because the dynasty was dying. And the dynasty was dying because its blood had been twisted for centuries. As Charles's condition worsened, his paranoia grew uncontrollable. He insisted on sleeping with relics believed to protect against witchcraft. He demanded that priests examine every object brought into his room to ensure no spell had been placed upon it. He refused certain foods, convinced they were poisoned. He began to believe that enemies were invading his dreams. But the most chilling moment came when his physicians openly admitted, in writing, that the king's condition had no cure, because it was written into his blood. In 1700, Charles II approached his final days, surrounded by priests reciting Latin, courtiers pretending loyalty, and rival factions preparing to seize the throne the moment his breath stopped. His empire watched in fear. Europe watched in anticipation. Everyone knew what was coming. Charles died on November 1, 1700. And what happened next shocked even the people who had seen his suffering firsthand. His autopsy report was so shocking that it circulated secretly among European courts. It claimed that the king's body was deformed inside and out. His heart was described as the size of a peppercorn. His intestines were said to be rotted. His lungs were corrupted. He had only one testicle, which was black as coal. His stomach was filled with fluid. His skull was unusually soft. Whether every detail was accurate or exaggerated, one thing was clear. Charles II was never physically capable of ruling an empire or producing an heir. And with him, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty ended forever. The world reacted instantly. Within weeks, the Spanish succession crisis ignited a war that involved nearly every major power in Europe. Armies marched. Kings declared claims. Territories were seized. Borders shifted. Tens of thousands died. All because one man, broken by generations of inbreeding, could not produce a child. Historians often ask, was the fall of the Spanish Habsburgs a curse? Or a tragedy created by their own choices? Some say it was divine punishment for the dynasty's cruelty and greed. Some say it was superstition mixed with coincidence. But modern science provides the clearest answer. The Habsburg family married within their own bloodline so obsessively that their genetics collapsed. Centuries of intermarriage had created the famous Habsburg jaw. But that was only the part the portraits showed. What the portraits hid was far more devastating. Weak heart, infertility, cognitive disorders, immune system failure, severe underdevelopment. Generation after generation, the DNA grew more unstable, until it produced Charles II, a king whose body was a battlefield of recessive genetic disorders. A king born to rule an empire, but doomed before he ever took his first breath. The fall of the Spanish Habsburgs was not the work of curses or witches. It was the slow revenge of nature, punishing a dynasty that believed it could defy biology itself. And when the final Habsburg king closed his eyes, the most powerful empire in the world fractured, changed forever, and drifted into history. The curse was not supernatural. The curse was their own creation. And Charles II was the tragic final echo of a bloodline that destroyed itself. This was the horrifying fate of Spain's Habsburg royals, the dynasty that believed its blood was sacred, until that same blood brought about its end.